The Apex Institute of Higher Dimensional Learning occupied approximately 17 cubic light-years of carefully folded spacetime, which made it either the most prestigious educational facility in the known universe, or the most elaborate waste of exotic matter, depending on which tenure committee you asked. Founded 6,000 standard cycles ago by the enlightened congregation of species who had achieved faster-than-light travel, peaceful coexistence, and the ability to digest complex carbohydrates without existential dread, the Institute prided itself on three fundamental principles: academic excellence, cultural diversity, and the absolute certainty that nothing truly dangerous could happen within its quantum-shielded halls. That third principle was about to have a really bad day. The admissions error occurred on a Wednesday, which was either cosmically ironic or just statistically inevitable, given that most bureaucratic catastrophes seem to favor midweek timing. Deep in the bowels of Sub-Administration Level 47, a Gelvian data clerk, whose 8 compound eyes were better suited for spotting predators on his homeworld's savannah than reading application fine print, had approved an exchange program request without noticing one critical detail. The applicant was from Earth. That backwater death world in the unfashionable end of the Orion Spur, where everything was slightly too heavy, moderately too radioactive, and aggressively trying to kill you at all times. The planet whose dominant species had somehow looked at the food chain, decided they disliked their position in it, and spent 10,000 years climbing to the top through sheer spite and the application of pointy sticks. The place where evolution had apparently gotten drunk, fallen asleep at the keyboard, and just kept hitting the increase aggression button. Nobody attended university from Earth, because nobody from Earth was supposed to know the Institute existed yet. The humans were still at least 2 centuries away from the technological threshold required for membership in the galactic academic community, which was really just a polite way of saying they needed 2 more centuries to become less terrifying. But bureaucracy, like entropy, moves in only one direction, and by the time anyone noticed the error, the human was already 3 weeks into her first semester. She sat in Advanced Xenobiology 401, which was currently discussing the mating habits of the crystalline hive minds of Andromeda Sector 12, and she was taking notes. This shouldn't have been remarkable. Students took notes. That was the entire point of student. But the way she took notes made Professor Hickstar's tertiary heart skip approximately 17 beats. The human wrote things down by dragging a primitive graphite implement across pulp tree fiber. This was already several steps backward from the standard neural link recording that every civilized species used. But what really disturbed Hickstar was the intensity. The human didn't just transcribe information. She attacked the page like it had personally insulted her ancestors, her handwriting a series of aggressive slashes that suggested each letter was a tiny declaration of war against the concept of ignorance itself. Hickstar, whose species had evolved from peaceful filter feeders and whose most aggressive ancestral behavior involved mildly disapproving water filtration, found this deeply unsettling. But it was the hand-raising that truly marked her as different. Every other species in the lecture hall absorbed information through their various sensory organs, with the quiet dignity of beings who had evolved past the need for constant validation. They understood that knowledge was meant to be received, contemplated, and eventually regurgitated during examinations in a civilized manner. The human treated every lecture like a gladiatorial arena, where ideas went to fight for survival. "Professor," she said, her hand shooting up before Hickstar had even finished explaining the crystalline reproductive cycle's dependency on stellar radiation patterns. If their reproduction requires proximity to a specific wavelength of cosmic rays, and those rays are only produced during supernova events, doesn't that mean their entire species is basically gambling on stellar death? That seems wildly inefficient. The rest of the class, composed of 17 different species who had never questioned anything presented by a tenure-track professor, turned to stare at her with whatever organs they used for staring. A Blorgian in the third row made a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. "Well, yes, technically," Hickstar stammered, his translator struggling with the concept of a student who apparently viewed fundamental biological processes as subject to peer review. "But evolution doesn't concern itself with efficiency in the way you're implying. It concerns itself with survival." "Right, but they've survived by putting all their reproductive eggs in the supernova basket, which statistically happens at most once per galaxy per century in their neighborhood. That's not a strategy. That's a cry for help. Hickstar's translator helpfully added a footnote that the human's tone contained what Earth linguists called snark, which was apparently a combination of sarcasm, mockery, and factual observation delivered with the emotional energy of someone who found the universe's design choices personally offensive. After class, Hickstar did what any rational being would do when confronted with something that challenged 17,000 years of academic tradition. He went directly to the faculty lounge and started drinking. The faculty lounge existed in a pocket dimension where time moved differently, allowing professors to complain about students for what felt like hours while only minutes passed in the real world. It was furnished in the style that academic institutions across the universe seemed to converge toward. Uncomfortable chairs that discouraged lingering, a beverage synthesizer that produced drinks universally described as adequate, and lighting that suggested whoever designed it had a personal vendetta against the concept of ambiance. Professor Yella of the philosophy department was already there, one of her forearms wrapped around a mug of something that was definitely not just coffee. Yelena's species, the contemplative harmonics of Nebula 9, had literally evolved from musical vibrations that gained sentience, which made them extraordinarily good at abstract thinking and extraordinarily bad at dealing with beings who refused to harmonize with the cosmic symphony. The human asked me to prove free will exists, Yelena said without preamble, staring into her mug like it might contain answers. Not as a thought exercise, as a requirement for accepting the semester's core thesis, she said, and I quote, "I'm not writing 15,000 words on ethical frameworks if we're all just meat puppets dancing to physics." Hickstar made a sound like a deflating balloon achieving enlightenment. She called the crystalline hive mind's reproduction strategy a cry for help. Did she imply they needed therapy? She implied the entire species needed to reevaluate their life choices. They sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the cruel absurdity of a universe that would send them a student who treated established knowledge like a suggestion box. Professor Wintour materialized through the wall, because Wintour's species didn't believe in doors and found the concept of solid barriers a personal affront. Wintour taught galactic history, and had the demeanor of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall and found both equally tedious. "Let me guess," Wintour said, his form solidifying into something approximately humanoid-shaped. "The human, how did you know?" Hickstar, because she spent 40 minutes of my lecture on the formation of the Galactic Council explaining how every founding species had essentially created a bureaucratic structure, designed to prevent anyone from making decisions quickly, which she described as the most elaborate commitment to mediocrity in the history of organized governance. She then asked if the entire council was just an excuse for species to feel important while accomplishing nothing. That's actually a fairly accurate summary of contemporary political science research. Yelena admitted, "Yes, but she's not supposed to realize that until her third year, and she certainly isn't supposed to say it out loud during the introductory course while the visiting council dignitary is sitting in the back row taking notes." The three professors exchanged looks that conveyed 17 different flavors of academic despair. "We need to give her something to do," Hickstar said finally, "something that will occupy her mind before she accidentally deconstructs the foundational principles of galactic civilization." "What kind of assignment?" Yellen asked. "Something comprehensive, challenging, something that will take weeks of intensive research, and keep her too busy to question the existential validity of everything we teach." Wintour's form rippled in what might have been amusement, or indigestion. "You want to give a human homework. Extensive homework. Homework designed to keep a species that climbed to the top of a deathworld food chain through persistence, hunting, and spite occupied long enough that she doesn't accidentally trigger an academic crisis. You know what happened the last time someone tried to contain human curiosity with busy work, right? They invented nuclear weapons just to see if they could split atoms. Then they did it twice just to make sure it wasn't a fluke." Hickstar's tertiary heart skipped another 17 beats. But he pressed forward anyway. "This is different. This is academia. What's the worst that could happen?" In the history of famous last words spoken by intelligent beings across the cosmos, this ranked somewhere between "what does this button do?" and "I'm sure the predator is full by now." But Hickstar was committed to his course of action with the kind of determination that usually preceded footnotes in history texts, explaining where everything went wrong. The assignment was posted the next morning to all students in the Integrated Studies program, which was the institute's way of throwing together students from different departments and hoping they learned something about interdisciplinary cooperation. The humans section contained representatives from biology, philosophy, engineering, history, and one very confused poetry major, who had taken a wrong turn during registration and was too polite to leave. The assignment brief was a masterwork of academic cruelty, disguised as an educational opportunity. Students were required to select one species from the Galactic registry, conduct comprehensive research into their biology, culture, technology and historical development, and present their findings in a format that demonstrated synthesis of knowledge across multiple disciplines. They had 4 weeks. The presentation would be before the entire department. Failure meant repeating the semester. Most students looked at this assignment and saw an opportunity to cruise through on species with well-documented histories and easily accessible research material. The harmonious unity of Tau Ceti had 17,000 published papers. The geometric collectives of Proxima had been studied so thoroughly their entire civilization was basically an open book with footnotes. The human looked at this assignment and saw something else entirely. She saw a challenge. The central archive of the Apex Institute existed in a state of quantum superposition between being absurdly vast and somehow still not having enough shelf space. It contained the collective knowledge of 6,000 species across 12 million years of recorded history, all neatly catalogued according to the Dewey dimensional system, which was like the Dewey decimal system, except it required understanding 17 additional spatial dimensions and the philosophical concept of numerical resentment. Most students approached the archive with reverence. It was, after all, the accumulated wisdom of galactic civilization, a temple to knowledge where even whispers felt like sacrilege. The human approached it like a hunter entering territory with particularly interesting prey. Head archivist Galactic had been maintaining the archive for 3 centuries, which was considered young for his species, but ancient by the standards of anyone who had to deal with student requests. His kind, the eternal documentarians, had evolved from a species of parasitic information gatherers, who fed on knowledge the way other beings fed on nutrients. They didn't technically need the information to survive, but they certainly got cranky without it. He noticed the human immediately, because she entered the archive at a speed that suggested the building might be on fire and she was either fleeing from, or running toward the flames. It was hard to tell which, and that uncertainty made his information processing clusters. "I need everything you have on species that almost went extinct," she announced, approaching his desk with the confidence of someone who had never been told that knowledge had filing systems for a reason. Galnac's translator took a moment to process this request, decided it was just as absurd in every language, and gave up trying to make it sound reasonable. "That is an extremely broad category. Could you perhaps narrow your parameters? Specific time period, sector of origin, type of near-extinction event, all of them, every species in the registry that came within a hair's breadth of total annihilation, but somehow survived anyway. I want to know how they did it, what they had to become to claw their way back from the edge." Galactic felt something in his information processing clusters that he would later describe to his therapist as profound existential unease. This was not a normal research request. Normal research requests involved students asking for pre-digested summaries of well-established topics that they could regurgitate for grades. This request implied actual intellectual curiosity, which was either refreshing or terrifying depending on one's perspective on chaos theory. "That query will return approximately 47,000 species profiles," he said carefully. "The archive can compile the list, but reviewing that much information would take several standard years even with neural link acceleration." The human smiled. It was the kind of smile that apex predators evolved to give their prey approximately 3 seconds before making terrible decisions. "Then I'd better get started." She claimed a study pod in the archive's deep research section, which was already strange because most students avoided the deep section. The deep section was where serious scholars went to lose themselves in primary sources and original documentation, emerging weeks later with insights that were either groundbreaking or signs of academic psychosis. Sometimes both. The humans set up camp. Literally. She brought in supplies that suggested she was planning to wage a sustained campaign against ignorance itself. stimulant beverages that smelled like regret and tasted like poor life choices, nutrition bars that claimed to contain all essential vitamins, but mostly contained the crushing weight of convenience, a portable data terminal that looked like it had survived at least 3 wars, and possibly started 2 of them. Then she began to work. The other students in the archive noticed first. A Thosian graduate student working on his dissertation watched in horror as the human consumed information at a rate that seemed physically impossible. She didn't just read the species profiles. She cross-referenced, she built comparison matrices. She identified patterns in survival strategies across completely unrelated evolutionary paths. Is she enjoying this? The Thosian whispered to his study partner, a Venuxian, whose species communicated primarily through bioluminescent horror. The Venuxian flashed a pattern that translated to, "I think she's having the time of her life, and that scares me more than anything I've ever witnessed." By day 3, the human had processed 6,000 species profiles, and started making notes that used terminology from 12 different academic disciplines simultaneously. Galactic received automated alerts that someone was accessing restricted anthropological data, classified military histories, and sealed psychological profiles at a rate that suggested either a team of researchers or a single very determined lunatic. He checked the access logs. One used Study Pod 17. The human. Galactic did something he had never done in 3 centuries of archival service. He went to check on a student personally. He found her surrounded by holographic displays showing evolutionary trees, extinction event timeline, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn chart connecting various species, survival mechanisms through a web of color-coded strings that looked like the conspiracy theory wall of someone who had figured out the universe's secret and wasn't happy about it. "I found the pattern," she said without looking up, because apparently she had evolved the ability to sense when authority figures approached with concerns about her mental state. 47,000 species faced extinction. 32,000 survived through adaptation, 7,000 through retreat, and 5,000 through sheer bloody-minded refusal to die. But 3,000 survived through something else entirely. What? Galactic asked, against his better judgment, and 3 centuries of professional distance. They survived by becoming dangerous. She turned, and her eyes had that particular glaze that researchers got when they had been staring at data for too long and started seeing truths that weren't meant to be seen. Every species that faced total annihilation, and came back stronger, had one thing in common. They stopped being victims. They looked at the universe that was trying to kill them and said, "No, actually, I think I'll kill you first." That is, a rather violent interpretation of evolutionary survival mechanisms. It's not interpretation, it's data. Look, she gestured at one of the displays. The crystalline hive minds everyone thinks are so fragile. 3,000 cycles ago, they were being hunted to extinction by stellar parasites. Know how they survived? They learned to weaponize supernovae. They don't just depend on stellar radiation for reproduction anymore. They can trigger it, on purpose, as a defense mechanism. Galactic's information processing clusters began filing this conversation under things I will need therapy to forget. And you're planning to present this as your assignment? Oh, I'm not presenting all of it. That would take weeks, and probably violate several information disclosure treaties. No, I'm presenting one species, the perfect example of survival through calculated danger. Which species? The human smile returned, and Galactic understood why apex predators were called apex. That's the fun part. I haven't decided yet, but when I do, it's going to make everyone in that lecture hall very, very uncomfortable. She turned back to her displays, dismissing him without another word, and Galactic retreated to his desk where he did something he hadn't done in 3 centuries. He filed an incident report. The report made its way through 17 levels of administrative bureaucracy, where it was stamped, and ultimately ignored because dealing with concerning student behavior required forms that nobody had updated since the Institute's founding, and nobody wanted to be the one to admit the forms were outdated.
Presentation day arrived with the inexorable certainty of entropy, taxation, and the eventual heat death of the universe. The Department of Integrated Studies had booked the Grand Auditorium, which was either optimistic or a gross misunderstanding of how many people actually cared about undergraduate presentations.
The auditorium could hold 3,000 beings across multiple dimensional planes. Usually these events attracted maybe 40. Today the auditorium was packed. Word had spread through the student network with the speed of gossip and the inevitability of disaster. The human was present, the human who had spent 4 weeks living in the archive like some kind of knowledge-addicted hermit. The human who had personally terrified the head archivist into filing paperwork. The human who, according to increasingly wild rumors, had either discovered the secret to galactic peace, or was about to accidentally start an interstellar incident. Professor Hickstar stood backstage, his tertiary heart attempting to escape through his thorax, watching students and faculty file in with expressions ranging from curiosity to the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for watching stellar collisions in slow motion. "This is fine," he muttered to himself. "This is a completely normal academic presentation. Nothing catastrophic can happen during a student presentation." Professor Winter materialized beside him, which would have been startling if Hickstar hadn't already accepted that today was going to be terrible. "You know, the last time you said nothing catastrophic could happen, the Venoxian student accidentally proved that free will was mathematically impossible and caused an existential crisis that required 3 months of therapy for everyone in the philosophy department. That was different." How? That student wasn't human. They watched as the human walked onto the stage with a confidence that suggested she either knew exactly what she was doing or had achieved such a state of academic zen that consequences had become meaningless. She carried no notes, no data tablet, just a small device that she plugged into the auditorium's holographic display system. The lights dimmed. The audience quieted. 3,000 beings across multiple planes of existence held whatever they used for breath. "Good afternoon," the human began, her voice carrying through the acoustically perfect space with unsettling clarity. "My assignment was to research a species from the Galactic Registry and present comprehensive findings on their biology, culture, technology, and historical development. I chose a species that almost went extinct approximately 200,000 standard cycles ago." The holographic display activated, showing a blue-green planet rotating peacefully in space. It looked docile, welcoming, even. Several students relaxed slightly. This species evolved on a death world with gravity 20% higher than galactic standard, where 95% of the native life forms were actively trying to kill each other at any given moment. The atmosphere contained enough oxygen to make everything wildly flammable. The weather patterns included rotating columns of destructive wind that the inhabitants named and tracked like they were keeping score. The Thosian student who had watched her in the archive began making a sound like a tea kettle achieving consciousness. Despite all this, the species thrived. They developed tool use, complex language, agriculture. Then something happened. The display changed, showing ice sheets covering continents, climate shift, massive volcanic activity. Their population crashed to fewer than 10,000 individuals. By every statistical model, they should have gone extinct. Professor Yula leaned forward in her seat, her forearms gripping the armrests with increasing pressure. But they did. Instead, they developed something that no other species in my research developed at such an early evolutionary stage. They developed the translator systems throughout the auditorium struggled briefly with that word, because spite wasn't really a survival mechanism that most species recognized as valid. They looked at the universe trying to kill them and took it personally. They didn't just adapt to their environment, they declared war on it. They hunted megafauna to extinction using nothing but rocks and anger. They domesticated wolves, which are essentially murderous fur missiles just to have them around as friends. They invented agriculture not because they understood plant biology, but because they were tired of walking to find food. The holographic display began showing images that made the audience increasingly uncomfortable. Primitive tools designed for violence. Cave paintings depicting hunts against creatures 3 times the size of the hunters. Evidence of fire use that suggested someone had figured out how to weaponize combustion before they'd figured out basic hygiene. They climbed to the top of their food chain through persistence hunting, which is the ecological equivalent of annoying something to death. They would chase prey for days until the animal literally collapsed from exhaustion. They invented cooking because they decided that their digestive limitations were optional. They developed language complex enough to tell lies, then built entire civilizations on cooperative fiction. A contemplative harmonic in the third row began vibrating at a frequency that indicated profound philosophical distress. This species survived extinction through calculated adaptation of danger. They didn't just endure their death world. They conquered, then they got bored and started looking at space. The display changed again, showing primitive rockets, space stations and technological progression that seemed to leap forward in centuries rather than millennia. Current projections suggest they'll achieve faster than light capability within the next 200 cycles. They've already split the atom, been to their moon, and sent probes beyond their solar system. They've survived diseases, wars, environmental collapse and their own worst impulse. They are resilient, creative, aggressive, and deeply, deeply curious about everything they're not supposed to touch. The human paused, letting the silence stretch like a threat. The species I researched is called Homo sapiens, commonly known as humans. You might have heard of us. The auditorium erupted into chaos that transcended normal acoustic properties and entered the realm of quantum probability. Several students tried to leave through dimensions that didn't technically exist. A professor in the back row began laughing with the kind of hysteria that suggested his sanity had filed for divorce and was taking the kids. Professor Hickstar's tertiary heart stopped completely, which was medically concerning but emotionally understandable. The human stood on stage, watching 3,000 beings have simultaneous realizations that they'd been casually attending classes with a representative of a species that had survived extinction through weaponizing stubbornness. And she smiled that apex predator smile. Question. The first question came from a brave or possibly suicidal geometric collective, who had apparently decided that if the universe was going to end, they might as well get answers first. You researched yourself? That's not... Is that even allowed? The human shrugged, which was a gesture that translated across species as, I acknowledge your concern and have decided it's not my problem. The assignment said to choose a species from the Galactic registry. Humans are in the registry. We're filed under pending review, potentially dangerous. Do not contact until further notice. Which, honestly, fair assessment. Professor Hickstar tried to stand, failed, tried again, and managed to achieve something approximating vertical. This is highly irregular. The spirit of the assignment was to research another species, to broaden cultural understanding, and I did. I researched humans from the perspective of galactic academia. I used your methodologies, your anthropological frameworks, your risk assessment matrices. I just happened to apply them to my own species, which gave me primary source access that would have made any other research project significantly easier. She paused. Also, everyone kept treating me like I was some kind of walking disaster waiting to happen, and I got curious about why. And what did you discover? This from Professor Yelena, who had apparently moved past existential horror, into the academic space where terrible knowledge became fascinating. That you're all terrified of us for extremely valid reasons. The human pulled up another display, this one showing comparative charts that made several audience members wish they'd skipped the presentation, and possibly the entire semester. Humans have a higher tolerance for risk than 87% of spacefaring species. We have faster reflexes than 92%. We can survive injuries that would kill most beings here. We heal from damage that other species consider fatal. And we do all of this while maintaining complex social structures, technological innovation, and what we call humor, which is apparently just verbal aggression disguised as entertainment. A Blorgian in the front row made a sound like a binary star system achieving harmonization. So you're saying humans are biologically optimized for survival in hostile conditions? I'm saying humans are biologically optimized for making conditions hostile, surviving them, and then complaining about it afterward while inventing new technology to make different conditions hostile. The human grinned. We're persistently creative about problems. The auditorium had moved past chaos into something more interesting, which was the space where academic curiosity collided with survival instinct, and produced deeply uncomfortable questions that people asked anyway. But why present this? Asked a poetry major, who had been too polite to leave, and was now regretting every life choice. Why tell us all this? Why make everyone aware that you're from a species that survives through calculated danger? The human's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile but suggested the same underlying concept that apex predators understood and prey species feared. Because you were all treating me like an anomaly. Like I was weird for asking questions, strange for working hard, concerning for being interested in things. But I'm not an anomaly. I'm just. And if one human exchange student can make this much noise in your academic system, you should probably start preparing for what happens when the rest of humanity figures out the university exists. The silence that followed had weight. It had texture. It had the quality of several thousand beings simultaneously realizing that their nice, orderly, peaceful galaxy was about to become significantly more complicated. Head archivist Gelnux stood from his seat in the back row, his information processing clusters working overtime. How long did you say? Until humans achieve faster than light capability. Current projections say 200 cycles, but those projections assume linear technological development, which is adorable but not how humans actually work. We tend to make breakthrough discoveries when we're either trying to solve completely different problems or actively trying to prove someone wrong about something. So it could be sooner. It could be next week. It could be 50 cycles. Humans are terrifyingly unpredictable, which is part of our survival strategy. We're really good at surprising things, including ourselves. Professor Wintour's form solidified into something more stable, which suggested he was either achieving clarity or having a breakdown, possibly both. So this entire presentation was what? A warning? A threat? An introduction? It was my assignment. You asked for comprehensive research on a species, including biology, culture, technology, and historical development. I delivered exactly that. The fact that it makes you uncomfortable says more about your expectations than my work. And there it was. The perfect academic trap. She had followed every rule, met every requirement, and produced work that was technically flawless, while being emotionally devastated. She had weaponized homework. The grading committee convened immediately after the presentation, which was less a committee and more a collection of professors trying to figure out how to evaluate work that was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. They met in the faculty lounge, naturally, because where else do you go when a student has accidentally undermined your entire worldview? We have to give her full marks, Professor Relina said, one of her forearms wrapped around a beverage that was definitely not adequate for the situation. The research is impeccable. The presentation was clear, well-structured, and thoroughly supported by evidence. She researched her own species. Hickstar protested weakly. She researched a species from the registry, using accepted academic methodology. The fact that she is that species doesn't invalidate the work. If anything, it provides insights that external research couldn't achieve. She scared 3,000 students and faculty. She provided information. It's not her fault the information was scary. That's just what humans are. Professor Wintour, who had been silent, finally spoke. The real question isn't whether we grade the assignment. The question is what we do now. She's right. Humans will achieve FTL capability eventually. And when they do, they're not going to be nice, quiet students who accept everything we teach them. They're going to question everything, challenge everything, and probably redesign half our systems because they find them inefficient. That's terrifying, Hickstar said. That's academia, Yelena corrected. Real academia. The kind where ideas fight, and the best ones survive. We've been comfortable for too long. Maybe the humans will be good for us. Or they'll accidentally destroy everything we've built. Or both. Probably both. The human received her grade 3 days later, full marks with honors, plus a footnote that her presentation had caused a 17% increase in applications for xenopsychology courses, and a 43% increase in anxiety medication prescriptions among faculty. She also received something else, an invitation to the Advanced Studies program, which was the Institute's way of saying, "You're too dangerous to leave unsupervised but too interesting to expel." The human accepted, naturally, because humans didn't become apex predators by avoiding challenges. And in the faculty lounge,
Professors across 17 departments began the long, difficult process of updating their course materials to account for a future where their students might actually fight back against established knowledge with primary sources, data analysis, and weaponized spy. The Apex Institute of Higher Dimensional Learning, founded on principles of academic excellence, cultural diversity, and the absolute certainty that nothing dangerous could happen within its quantum-shielded halls, was about to discover what every other system humanity had encountered eventually learned.
The most dangerous homework wasn't the assignment you gave humans. It was the one they gave themselves, figuring out how to survive, thrive, and make everyone else very, very nervous in the process.